There's nothing quite like watching a child lose everything and still find the strength to keep going. When 12-year-old Jessie Mae McCall lost her father, she didn't just lose her only family. She inherited what everyone in Copper Ridge called the most worthless ranch in 3 counties. The broken-down property looked like a collection of rotting wood and rusted metal. Town children threw stones at her fence and called it a junkyard. Adults whispered that the poor girl was stuck with her father's mistakes. But Jessie had something nobody knew about. A faded map her dying father pressed into her small hands. He whispered words that made no sense then, but would change everything later. While everyone saw worthless land, Jessie spent her evenings studying every mark on that worn paper. What secret had her father hidden on property that everyone knew was nothing but trouble? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind never stopped blowing in Copper Ridge, and it carried with it the whispers of a town that had grown comfortable with its cruelties. Jessie Mae McCall pulled her father's oversized coat tighter around her thin shoulders. As she walked down Main Street, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, the coat still smelled like him, leather and tobacco, and something she couldn't name but knew was safety. She could feel their eyes on her, the way people looked when they thought they were being subtle. Mrs. Henderson from the general store peered through her window, shaking her head with that expression adults wore when they witnessed something they considered tragic but inevitable. The banker, Mr. Cromwell, stood outside his building in his pressed suit, checking his pocket watch with the kind of importance that small-town men cultivated when they wanted to feel bigger than their circumstances. There goes that poor McCall. "Girl," she heard Mrs. Patterson say to her companion as they passed on the wooden sidewalk. "Lord knows what'll become of her now." Jessie kept walking, her chin raised in the stubborn way her father had taught her. Samuel McCall had been many things, but he'd never been a man to bow his head to gossip or give others the satisfaction of seeing him broken. That strength lived in his daughter now, even if she was only 12, and felt the weight of the world pressing down on her small frame. The ranch sat 3 miles outside of town, accessible only by a dirt road that became nearly impassable when the rains came. Today, the sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air into something thick and oppressive. Jessie walked this road twice a day, once to town for supplies when she could afford them, and once back home to the place that everyone said wasn't worth the nails holding it together. But they were wrong about that, just like they'd been wrong about her father. The old ranch house came into view as she crested the small hill that marked her property line. It wasn't much to look at. She'd admit that. The roof sagged in places where the supporting beams had given way to age and neglect. The porch steps creaked ominously under even her slight weight, and the paint had long since peeled away to reveal weathered grey wood underneath. But it was hers, and it had been her father's, and that made it worth more than all the pristine houses in Copper Ridge combined. "Buck!" she called, and immediately heard the answering whinny from the small corral behind the house. The horse was old, older than Jessie herself, but he'd been her father's most trusted companion, and now he was hers. Buck was a sturdy bay, with a white blaze down his face and eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than most of the people in town. Her father used to say that Buck understood things that humans were too complicated to figure out, and Jessie had come to believe that was true. She spent the next hour tending to him, brushing his coat and checking his hooves, the way her father had taught her. These quiet moments with Buck were when she felt closest to the man who'd raised her, when she could almost hear his voice, explaining the proper way to care for a horse, the importance of earning an animal's trust through consistency and kindness. "You miss him too, don't you, old boy?" she whispered, and Buck nickered softly in response, nudging her shoulder with his great head. The barn was another story entirely. While the house might be shabby, the barn was downright dangerous. Several of the stalls had collapsed entirely, and the loft above creaked ominously whenever the wind picked up. Her father had always meant to fix it, had talked about it every spring when the weather turned favorable for construction work. But somehow there had never been enough money or enough time, and now it was just another item on a list of repairs that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old girl to manage alone. Still, she'd found ways to make it work. She'd cleared out one stall completely and reinforced it with boards salvaged from the collapsed sections. It wasn't pretty, but it was safe enough for Buck, and that was what mattered. Her father had taught her to be practical above all else, to work with what she had rather than wishing for what she didn't. As evening approached, Jessie made her way back to the house and the ritual that had become the most important part of her day. She pulled the worn map from its hiding place in her father's old desk, spreading it carefully across the kitchen table by the light of a kerosene lamp. The paper was soft with age, yellow around the edges, and marked with symbols and notations that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Her father had pressed this map into her hands during his final moments, his breathing shallow, and his eyes glazed with fever. "Promise me," he'd whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the wind rattling the windows. "Promise me you'll figure it out. Everything you need is right here, Jessie Mae. Everything I couldn't give you while I was alive." She'd promised, of course, because what else could a daughter do when her dying father asked something of her? But in the weeks since his passing, the map had remained as mysterious as ever. There were drawings that might have been trees or might have been something else entirely, lines that could represent roads or rivers or boundaries, and scattered throughout, small symbols that looked almost like the brands used on cattle, but different somehow. The most puzzling element was a series of numbers written in the margin: 1847, 1862, 1885. They could have been dates, but if so, they didn't correspond to anything Jessie knew about her family's history. The McCall family had only settled in this area in the early 1900s, well after those dates would have had any significance. Jessie traced the lines on the map with her finger, the way she'd done dozens of times before. Her father had been many things, a dreamer certainly, and perhaps too trusting for his own good, but he hadn't been the kind of man to indulge in fantasies. If he'd given her this map and told her it was important, then it was. She just had to be smart enough to figure out what it meant. Outside, Buck whinnied softly, and Jessie looked up to see a figure on horseback silhouetted against the setting sun. Her heart jumped. Visitors were rare, and rarely brought good news. She quickly folded the map and tucked it back into the desk drawer before stepping onto the porch. The rider was Tom Bradley, one of the neighboring ranchers whose property bordered hers to the east. He was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of working under the desert sun. He'd been one of the few people in the area who'd treated her father with something approaching respect, though Jessie had always sensed there was more to their relationship than simple neighborly courtesy. "Evening, Miss McCall," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Hope you don't mind me riding over." "Not at all, Mr. Bradley. Would you like to come in for some coffee?" The offer was automatic, the kind of hospitality her father had taught her to extend to guests, even when she could barely afford the coffee herself. "That's kind of you, but I can't stay long. Just wanted to check on you, see how you're managing." His eyes took in the sagging porch roof and the general state of disrepair that seemed to multiply daily. "This is a lot of responsibility for someone your age." There was something in his tone that made Jessie cautious. She'd learned to read the subtle inflections in adult voices, the way they could convey sympathy while delivering unwelcome news. "I'm managing just fine, thank you." "I'm sure you are. Your father raised you to be strong." Bradley paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "But strength isn't always enough, especially when winter comes. This place needs work, and work costs money. I know that." Jessie kept her voice level, though she felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "I've been thinking," Bradley continued, "and I might be able to help. I could use the additional grazing land, and you could use the income. I'd be willing to lease your property, give you enough to get yourself set up somewhere more suitable for a young lady." The offer hung in the air between them, and Jessie understood what he wasn't saying directly. He wanted her gone, wanted her to give up on the ranch and move to town where the Women's Church Auxiliary could take her under their collective wing and turn her into the kind of proper young lady that Copper Ridge deemed acceptable. "I appreciate the thought, Mr. Bradley, but this is my home. I'm not leaving." Something flickered in his eyes, disappointment maybe, or perhaps something else. "Well, if you change your mind, the offer stands. But Jessie Mae, you need to understand that good intentions don't pay bills or fix roofs. Winter's coming, and this place won't keep you warm if it falls down around your ears." After he left, Jessie stood on the porch, watching his figure disappear into the gathering darkness. She knew he meant well, knew that his concern was probably genuine, but she also knew that giving up the ranch meant giving up the last connection she had to her father, and that was something she couldn't do. Not when he'd trusted her with that map, not when he'd believed she was capable of figuring out whatever secret he'd been trying to share with her. Buck wandered over from his corral, drawn by some instinct that told him his human needed comfort. Jessie wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in his familiar scent of hay and horse and dependable warmth. "We'll figure it out, won't we, boy? Dad wouldn't have left us with something impossible." She spoke the words as much to convince herself as to comfort the horse. "He believed in me, so I have to believe in me too." The night settled around them, vast and full of possibilities that felt both promising and terrifying. Somewhere in the darkness, answers waited to be discovered. Jessie Mae McCall was determined to find them, no matter what it took. The discovery came 3 days after Bradley's visit, when desperation finally drove Jessie to search through her father's belongings, more thoroughly than grief had previously allowed. She'd been looking for anything of value she could sell, a watch perhaps, or tools that might bring a few dollars at the general store. The bills were piling up, and winter was indeed coming, just as Bradley had warned. She'd avoided her father's bedroom since his death, unable to face the memories that lived in his personal spaces. But practical need finally overcame emotional reluctance, and she found herself standing in the doorway of the small room where Samuel McCall had spent his final months, weakened by the illness that had taken him far too soon. The room was sparse, containing little more than a narrow bed, a battered dresser, and a trunk that had belonged to her grandfather. Jessie had seen that trunk countless times throughout her childhood, but her father had always kept it locked, telling her it contained old things that weren't ready to see the light of day yet. Now, searching through his dresser drawers, she found the key tucked inside a pair of wool socks that still carried his scent. Her hands trembled as she inserted it into the trunk's lock, wondering if she was violating some trust by opening something he'd kept sealed during his lifetime. The hinges protested with a rusty squeak, revealing contents that made her breath catch in her throat. On top lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Beneath it, she could see folded papers, a few small objects wrapped in cloth, and what looked like official documents bearing government seals. Shakasin. Journal fell open in her hands to a page dated just 6 months before her father's death. The handwriting was his, though shakier than she remembered, probably because he was already fighting the illness that would eventually claim him. If Jessie Mae is reading this, then I've run out of time to explain everything properly. The entry began. I've spent her whole life trying to protect her from the truth about who I really was, but now that protection might be the very thing that destroys her future. She deserves to know that her father wasn't the failure this town believes him to be. Jessie sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unsteady. She'd known her father had secrets. All children sense such things about their parents, but she'd never imagined they ran this deep. The journal entries painted a picture of Samuel McCall that bore little resemblance to the quiet rancher she'd thought she knew. According to his own words, he'd spent 15 years working for the federal government in various capacities, some of which he couldn't detail even in his private writings. He'd been involved in surveying expeditions, mineral assessments, and what he cryptically referred to as resource preservation activities. The ranch was never supposed to be permanent, one entry read. It was cover, a way to stay in the area while I completed my final assignment. But then Sarah died giving birth to Jessie Mae, and suddenly nothing else mattered except keeping my daughter safe and giving her as normal a childhood as possible. Jessie's mother had died when she was born. That much she'd always known. But the grief she'd always sensed in her father took on new dimensions when viewed through the lens of a man who'd given up everything he'd worked for to raise a child alone. Further entries revealed the truth about the ranch's apparent worthlessness. "Let them think it's useless," her father had written. "Let them mock the crazy hermit who can't make his land productive. They have no idea what lies beneath their feet, and that ignorance has been my greatest protection." The map she'd been studying suddenly made terrible sense. Those weren't random markings. They were survey notes, geological indicators, and most importantly, the precise locations of several caches her father had buried over the years. The mysterious numbers in the margins weren't dates at all, but coordinates marking spots where he'd hidden things of value. But the most shocking revelation came in the journal's final entries, written during the last weeks of her father's life. He'd become aware that his activities hadn't gone entirely unnoticed, that certain people in Copper Ridge had begun asking questions about his background and his property. More disturbing still, he suspected that someone had been searching the ranch while he was bedridden, looking for whatever they believed he might have hidden. "Cromwell came by again today," one entry noted. "Asked about mineral rights, offered to buy the property for twice what any reasonable person would pay for worthless land. I told him no, of course, but his eyes told a different story. He knows something, or thinks he does. I need to prepare Jessie Mae for the possibility that my death won't end their interest in this place." The banker. Jessie's blood ran cold as she read her father's suspicions about the man who held the note on their property, the man who had the power to foreclose if she couldn't make the payments. She turned to the wrapped objects in the trunk, unwrapping them with careful hands. The first contained what appeared to be survey instruments, a compass, measuring devices, and tools she didn't recognize, but that clearly belonged to someone with professional expertise in land assessment. The second bundle held a collection of small metal objects that looked like samples of some kind, along with detailed notes about their composition and origin. But it was the official documents that truly changed everything. Her father's discharge papers from the Army Corps of Engineers, commendations for service in classified operations, and most importantly, a land patent that described her ranch's boundaries in terms that were significantly different from what she'd always believed. According to the patent, the McCall property extended far beyond the obvious boundaries she'd grown up with. The legal description included mineral rights to an area nearly 10 times larger than the modest ranch she'd always known, encompassing land that several of the town's most prominent families currently claimed as their own. "My God," Jessie whispered, understanding finally dawning. Her father hadn't been a failure at all. He'd been hiding in plain sight, protecting resources that others would have killed for, sacrificing his reputation and his social standing to keep something valuable out of the wrong hands. But now he was gone, and the people who'd been watching him would soon realize that a 12-year-old girl might be an easier target than a mysterious former government agent. A sound from outside made her freeze. Hoofbeats, moving slowly, as if someone were trying to approach without being noticed. Jessie quickly gathered the journal and documents, shoving them back into the trunk and locking it. She slipped the key into her pocket and moved to the window, peering through the curtains. 3 men sat on horseback at the edge of her property, too far away to identify clearly, but close enough to signal that they weren't just passing through. They seemed to be watching the house, and something about their posture suggested this wasn't their first time surveying her land from that vantage point. Buck whinnied nervously from his corral. His ears pricked forward in the way that meant he sensed something threatening. Animals knew things that humans often missed, and Jessie had learned to trust her horse's instincts. The men eventually moved on, but their presence confirmed what her father's journal had suggested. She wasn't dealing with idle curiosity or neighborly concern. Someone knew or suspected that the McCall ranch held secrets worth pursuing, and her father's death had apparently emboldened them to take more direct action. That night, Jessie sat at the kitchen table with her father's journal open before her, cross-referencing his notes with the mysterious map. The symbols that had puzzled her for weeks now revealed themselves as markers corresponding to his written descriptions. A drawing that looked like crossed sticks indicated the location of surveying equipment. A circle with a dot in the center marked the spot where he'd buried what he called insurance documentation. But the largest symbol on the map, a star enclosed in a square, remained mysterious. Her father's journal entries became frustratingly vague when referring to whatever lay at that location, noting only that it represented the completion of my final assignment and Jessie Mae's real inheritance. She was no longer just a grieving daughter trying to make sense of her father's possessions. She was the inheritor of a secret that powerful people wanted to claim, the guardian of knowledge that could either secure her future or destroy her entirely. The weight of that responsibility should have been terrifying for someone her age, but instead Jessie felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death: purpose. Samuel McCall had trusted her with the truth, and she would prove worthy of that trust. Whatever he'd hidden, whatever he'd died protecting, she would find it and ensure it served the purpose he'd intended. The people who thought they could intimidate a 12-year-old girl into abandoning her inheritance were about to discover they'd underestimated both the daughter and the father who'd raised her. Dawn brought clarity to Jessie's resolve, and with it, a systematic approach to understanding her father's legacy. She rose before sunrise, fed Buck, and returned to the trunk with the deliberate purpose of a detective examining evidence. The journal had given her context, but the map would give her direction. Among her father's surveying equipment, she found an antique compass that immediately caught her attention. Unlike the simple directional compass she'd expected, this instrument was far more sophisticated, with multiple dials and measurements she didn't understand. When she carried it outside to test its accuracy, something remarkable happened. In most locations around the ranch, it pointed steadily north as expected, but in certain spots, the needle seemed confused, swinging erratically as if responding to something other than magnetic north. "Interesting, isn't it?" she murmured to Buck, who had wandered over to investigate her activities. "Dad wrote about magnetic anomalies in his journal. I think this compass is designed to detect them." She spent the morning walking the property with the compass, mapping its unusual behavior. There were 3 distinct areas where the needle went. Wild, one near the collapsed section of the barn, another by a cluster of ancient oak trees at the property's western edge, and a third in what appeared to be empty scrubland behind the house. Each location corresponded to symbols on her father's map, confirming her growing understanding of his system. But more importantly, the compass's erratic behavior suggested that something metallic or mineral-rich lay buried beneath those spots, something significant enough to interfere with the instrument's normal function. Her excitement was tempered by the awareness that she wasn't alone in her investigations. Twice during her morning survey, she'd noticed dust clouds in the distance, suggesting riders who were keeping her activities under observation. When she waved in their direction, the distant figures disappeared behind ridges or stands of trees, confirming that their interest was anything but innocent. "We're being watched, Buck," she told the horse, as they took shelter in the barn's shade during the brutal midday heat. "Dad was right to be careful, and I need to be even more so." The barn, despite its decrepit condition, offered unexpected advantages for her investigation. The collapsed sections created natural blind spots where she could work without being observed from the surrounding hills. More importantly, she discovered that her father had reinforced certain areas of the structure with unusual materials, not just standard lumber, but metal supports that seemed far more substantial than necessary for a simple ranch building. Working carefully with tools salvaged from her father's workshop, Jessie began clearing debris from the area where the compass readings were strongest. Buck watched her work with patient interest, occasionally nickering encouragement when her progress slowed. 3 feet down, her shovel struck something that wasn't dirt or rock. Further excavation revealed a metal box, carefully waterproofed, and buried with the precision of someone who intended it to survive for decades. Inside, she found her first cache of her father's hidden resources, not treasure in the sense of gold or jewels, but something potentially more valuable. Detailed geological surveys of the entire region, including mineral assessments that revealed significant copper and silver deposits throughout the area. The surveys were official government documents, stamped and signed by agencies she'd never heard of, dating back to her father's time in federal service. According to these reports, the land currently occupied by Copper Ridge and its surrounding ranches sat atop one of the richest mineral veins in the territory, information that had apparently been classified and kept from public knowledge for reasons the documents didn't explain. But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of more recent papers documenting unauthorized mining activities in the region. Someone had been extracting minerals from various properties around Copper Ridge for at least 5 years, operating small-scale operations that wouldn't be immediately obvious to property owners, but would be enormously profitable over time. Documentation included photographs, sample analyses, and financial records suggesting that this illegal mining had generated substantial wealth for whoever was behind it. Most damaging of all, the papers included correspondence indicating that certain local officials were not only aware of the activities, but were actively facilitating them in exchange for significant payments. Cromwell's name appeared repeatedly in these documents, along with the names of other prominent Copper Ridge citizens. Her father had been building a case, gathering evidence that would expose a conspiracy involving theft of mineral resources on a massive scale. "No wonder they wanted him gone," Jessie whispered, understanding finally why her father had lived under suspicion and why his death might not have been entirely natural. He hadn't just been protecting his own secrets, he'd been documenting crimes that could destroy the town's power structure if revealed. As evening approached, Jessie carefully reburied the empty cash box and returned to the house with the documents, hidden in her father's old saddlebags. She needed time to study everything thoroughly, to understand the full scope of what she'd inherited along with the ranch. But her solitude was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, not the distant observers she'd grown accustomed to, but riders coming directly to her door. She quickly hid the saddlebags and went to the porch, where she found herself facing 2 men she recognized as employees of the county sheriff's office. "Evening, Miss McCall," said the older of the two, a deputy named Morrison who'd attended her father's funeral. "Sorry to bother you, but we've had reports of trespassing in the area. Folks concerned about your safety living out here alone." Jessie kept her expression neutral, though her mind raced. "I haven't seen any trespassers, Deputy Morrison. Have there been problems with other properties?" "Few incidents here and there, nothing for you to worry about most likely, but we wanted to make sure you knew to be careful. Maybe consider staying in town for a while until we sort out what's going on." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of casual authority that adults used when they expected automatic compliance, but Jessie recognized it for what it was: another attempt to get her away from the ranch, possibly coordinated with the same people who'd been watching her property. I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine here. Buck takes good care of me, and I know this land better than any trespasser would." The younger deputy, whose name she didn't know, spoke for the first time. "That's a pretty big responsibility for someone your age, miss. Your neighbors are worried about you." "My neighbors are welcome to visit if they're concerned, but this is my home and I'm staying." After the deputies left, Jessie sat on her porch with Buck nearby, watching the sun set over land that suddenly felt both more valuable and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Her father's compass lay heavy in her pocket, a tool that had already begun revealing secrets that powerful people had killed to protect. Tomorrow she would continue her investigation, following the compass to the other locations marked on her father's map. But tonight, she would study the documents she'd recovered, preparing for a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. The 12-year-old girl who'd inherited a worthless ranch was gone. In her place sat a young woman who understood that she held evidence of crimes worth fortunes, and that the people who'd committed those crimes would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The second cache, buried beneath the ancient oaks, yielded treasures of a different sort. Following her compass to the spot where its needle spun most wildly, Jessie discovered that her father had chosen his hiding places with the strategic mind of a man who understood both geology and human nature. The oak grove provided natural camouflage, and the massive root systems would have made casual excavation nearly impossible. Working carefully in the pre-dawn hours to avoid detection, she uncovered a larger container than the first, a military surplus ammunition box that had been modified with additional waterproofing. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, she found personal items that painted an even more complete picture of the man she'd thought she knew. The most striking discovery was a silver locket containing a photograph she'd never seen before. It showed her father as a much younger man, dressed in military uniform and standing with two other soldiers beside what appeared to be surveying equipment. The back of the photograph bore a date, 1889, and the notation Mineral Survey Team, Colorado Territory. But it wasn't just her father's youthful appearance that caught her attention. One of the other men in the photograph looked remarkably familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she'd seen that face before. He was older than her father, with distinctive features and eyes that seemed to hold secrets, even in the faded photograph. Accompanying the locket was a collection of letters, carefully preserved and tied with ribbon. Most were official correspondence related to her father's government service, but several were personal notes from the man in the photograph, someone who signed himself simply as J. Thorne. The letters revealed a partnership that had extended far beyond professional duties. Thorne wrote of shared dangers, successful missions, and a friendship forged in circumstances that the letters only hinted at. More importantly, the most recent letter was dated just 2 years earlier, suggesting that this relationship had continued long after her father's supposed retirement to ranching. "Samuel," the letter began, "the situation in Copper Ridge has become more complicated than we anticipated. The mining operation is larger than our initial intelligence suggested, and the local officials' involvement runs deeper than simple corruption. We may need to accelerate our timeline." The letter went on to discuss asset recovery and evidence preservation, using language that made it clear both men were involved in some kind of ongoing investigation. Most significantly, Thorne mentioned the girl and emphasized the importance of ensuring her safety when the operation concludes. They'd been planning for this scenario, her father's death and her inheritance of secrets that dangerous people would want to claim. Everything he'd done, from maintaining his cover as a failed rancher to carefully documenting the illegal mining activities, had been part of a larger strategy that involved this mysterious partner. But who was J. Thorne, and where was he now? The answer came from an unexpected source. After hiding her morning's discoveries, Jessie made her usual trip to town for supplies, using the journey to think through what she'd learned. At Henderson's general store, she found herself standing behind elderly Martha Whitman, one of the few people in Copper Ridge who'd consistently treated her with kindness since her father's death. "Jessie Mae," Mrs. Whitman said warmly, turning to acknowledge her. "How are you managing out there, dear?" "Well enough, thank you, Mrs. Whitman. And yourself?" "Oh, getting by. These old bones don't appreciate the desert heat the way they used to." She paused, studying Jessie's face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd lived long enough to read people accurately. "You know, you remind me more and more of your father as you grow up, especially around the eyes, that same look of quiet determination." On impulse, Jessie decided to take a risk. "Mrs. Whitman, did my father ever mention anyone named Thorne?" The elderly woman's expression changed subtly, surprise flickering across her features before being replaced by something more guarded. "Why do you ask, dear?" "I found some old letters among his things. The name seemed familiar, but I can't place it." Mrs. Whitman glanced around the store, ensuring they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "There was a man named Thorne, who visited your father occasionally over the years. Quiet fellow, well-dressed, spoke like he had education. They'd sit on your porch in the evenings talking in low voices about things I couldn't hear from the road." "What did he look like?" "Older than your father, grey hair, distinguished bearing. Had eyes that missed nothing. Reminded me of men I'd known during the war, the ones who'd seen more than their share of trouble." She paused thoughtfully. "Haven't seen him since before your father took sick. Always wondered what became of him." That afternoon, Jessie returned to her father's trunk and went through his belongings more systematically, looking for any additional clues about Thorne's identity or whereabouts. Hidden in a false bottom that she discovered only by accident, she found a small collection of items that made her heart race. The first was a telegraph form, pre-written but never sent, addressed to someone with the initials JT in Denver, Colorado. The message was cryptic but urgent. "Package secured. Delivery required immediately. SM." More revealing was a newspaper clipping from a Denver paper dated just 3 months before her father's death. The article described the retirement of Colonel James Thorne from the Army Corps of Engineers, noting his distinguished service in geological survey and resource management operations throughout the Western Territories. Colonel Thorne. The face in the photograph suddenly made sense. She'd seen it in other newspaper clippings her father had saved over the years, articles about mining regulations and territorial development that had seemed like random interests at the time. But the most important discovery was a hand-drawn map of Copper Ridge and its surrounding area, marked with symbols that matched those on her father's treasure map. This version was more detailed, showing not just the locations where her father had hidden his caches, but also the sites of the illegal mining operations, the transportation routes being used to move extracted materials, and what appeared to be a central coordination point located right in the heart of town. The coordination point was marked with Cromwell's initials, confirming her suspicions about the banker's role in the conspiracy. But the map revealed something else that made her blood run cold. Her ranch sat at the center of the entire operation, with tunnels and excavation sites radiating outward from her property in all directions. They hadn't just been stealing from her land. They'd been using it as the base for a massive theft operation that extended throughout the region, extracting minerals from numerous properties while the owners remained unaware. As evening approached, Jessie sat with Buck in the corral, studying her father's maps and trying to piece together a plan. She now understood the scope of what she'd inherited, not just a ranch and some buried treasures, but evidence of crimes that would destroy half the town's leadership if exposed. The third cache lay in the scrubland behind the house, and what Jessie found there changed everything she thought she knew about her father's past. The compass led her to a spot that seemed utterly unremarkable, a patch of sandy soil dotted with sagebrush and marked only by a single weathered fence post that she'd passed countless times without a second thought. But 3 feet down, her shovel struck metal with a hollow ring that sent excitement coursing through her veins. This container was different from the others, larger, heavier, and bearing markings that spoke of official military use. When she finally wrestled it from the earth, Buck snorted nervously, as if he too sensed the significance of what she'd uncovered. Inside, wrapped in waterproof material and preserved with the care of someone who understood their importance, were her father's military service records. But these weren't the simple discharge papers she'd found in his trunk. These documents told the story of Captain Samuel McCall, decorated veteran of conflicts that history books barely mentioned, specialist in what the records termed resource reconnaissance and territorial security operations. The medals came first, Bronze Star, Silver Star, and others she didn't recognize, but that clearly represented exceptional service under dangerous conditions. Each came with citations describing actions that painted her father as far more than the quiet rancher she'd known. He'd led survey teams into hostile territory, established secure supply lines through Indian country, and somehow managed to complete his missions while maintaining what the records called exemplary conduct in dealings with native populations. But it was the dog tags that truly shocked her. Worn and scratched from years of use, they bore her father's name and rank, but also a designation she'd never heard before: Special Operations Division, Territorial Survey Corps. The date of issue was 1885, making her father a career military man for far longer than she'd ever imagined. With trembling hands, she unfolded a collection of commendations and official letters that revealed the true scope of his service. Samuel McCall hadn't just been a soldier. He'd been part of an elite unit responsible for identifying and securing valuable resources in newly acquired territories. The letters described missions to assess mineral wealth, establish secure transportation routes, and most importantly, prevent valuable resources from falling into the hands of foreign interests and criminal enterprises. One letter, signed by a territorial governor, specifically praised Captain McCall's success in neutralizing organized theft of federal mineral assets and recommended him for continued covert operations as circumstances require. The date on that letter was just 10 years earlier, long after she'd assumed her father had left military service behind. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't retired to ranching. He'd been assigned to this area as part of an ongoing mission to protect the region's mineral wealth. His apparent failure as a rancher had been deliberate cover for surveillance and investigation of the very crimes she'd been uncovering through his hidden caches. Everything she'd attributed to her father's poor luck or lack of business sense had actually been calculated strategy. He'd allowed his ranch to deteriorate and his reputation to suffer because success would have drawn the wrong kind of attention. The isolation, the mockery from townspeople, even the economic struggles, all of it had been part of a mission that had consumed the last decades of his life. But the most devastating revelation came in the form of a sealed envelope marked "For emergency use only, in event of discovery or death." Inside, she found a letter addressed to her specifically, written in her father's hand, and dated just 1 month before his death. "My dearest Jessie Mae," it began. "If you're reading this, then I've run out of time to tell you the truth in person. And for that, I'm deeply sorry. I've spent your entire life trying to give you a normal childhood, but I fear my mission has made that impossible." The letter went on to explain that his illness hadn't been natural. He'd been slowly poisoned over months by someone who'd discovered his true identity and purpose. He'd realized what was happening too late to save himself, but he'd had enough. Time to ensure that his evidence and his mission would survive through her. "You're not just my daughter," he wrote. "You are my chosen successor, trained from childhood in the skills you'll need to complete what I started. Every lesson about reading the land, every hour spent learning to track and observe, every story about justice and courage, all of it was preparation for this moment." The weight of revelation nearly overwhelmed her. She sat in the dirt beside the empty cache, surrounded by the evidence of her father's secret life, understanding finally that her entire existence had been shaped by forces she'd never suspected. The quiet rancher who'd raised her with such love and care had been carrying secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. But even as the enormity of her inheritance became clear, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, but purpose. Her father had trusted her with the completion of his mission, and everything he'd taught her suddenly made sense in this new context. The tracking skills, the careful observation of human behavior, the emphasis on thinking before acting, all of it had been preparation for the role she now found herself in. Buck wandered over as she sat in contemplation, his presence providing the comfort she needed to process what she'd learned. Her father's horse had probably known more about his master's true nature than she had, she realized. Animals sensed things that humans often missed, and Buck's unwavering loyalty made more sense now that she understood what kind of man her father had really been. That evening, as she carefully reburied the empty cache and returned to the house, Jessie felt the last vestiges of childhood slipping away. She was no longer a grieving daughter trying to make sense of her father's possessions. She was the inheritor of an unfinished mission, the keeper of secrets that could bring justice to victims of a massive criminal conspiracy, the people who'd killed her father, and she no longer had any doubt that his death had been murder, thought they'd eliminated the threat he represented. They'd assumed that a 12-year-old girl would be easily intimidated or manipulated into abandoning her inheritance. They were about to discover how wrong they'd been, standing on her porch that night, looking out over land that she now understood was far more valuable than anyone suspected. Jessie felt her father's presence in the wind that never stopped blowing across the desert. He'd given her everything she needed to continue his work, the evidence, the tools, and most importantly, the training to use both effectively. Tomorrow, she would begin the final phase of her investigation, following the compass to the location marked with the star inside a square. Whatever her father had hidden there, whatever represented the completion of his final assignment, she would find it and use it to honor both his memory and his mission. The scared little girl who'd inherited a worthless ranch was gone forever. In her place stood a young woman who understood that she held the power to expose a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of local government, and that justice for her father's murder lay within her grasp. The coded letters came to light when Jessie returned to her father's trunk with new understanding of what to look for. Hidden beneath the false bottom, in a compartment she'd missed during her first searches, lay a collection of correspondence that revealed the true scope of her father's final mission. The letters bore official government seals and were written in a mixture of plain English and coded references that she was beginning to understand. Most were signed by officials in the territorial government, but several came from Washington itself, bearing the letterhead of the Department of the Interior and addressed to Agent S. McCall, Special Assignment, Copper Ridge Territory. The most recent communication, dated just weeks before her father's death, painted a picture of urgency and mounting concern. Agent McCall, it read, reports of accelerated extraction activities in your sector suggest that our adversaries have become aware of federal interest in the region. Recommend immediate activation of contingency protocols and preparation for asset recovery operations. The letter went on to specify that Colonel Thorne had been dispatched to provide additional support, and that full federal backing was authorized for whatever actions might be necessary to protect territorial interests. Most importantly, the ICE letter confirmed that any resources recovered during the operation would be held in trust for Agent McCall's designated heir until such time as the mission could be concluded. Jessie felt her breath catch as the implications became clear. Her father hadn't just been documenting crimes for potential future prosecution. He'd been conducting an active federal investigation with the full authority of the United States government. The minerals being stolen weren't just valuable commodities. They were federal assets being protected under territorial law. More shocking still was the discovery that her inheritance had legal standing far beyond simple property rights. According to the coded correspondence, she was officially recognized as her father's designated successor in operational capacity, meaning that his federal authority had been transferred to her upon his death. A 12-year-old girl with the legal backing of the territorial government to investigate and prosecute mineral theft on a massive scale. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified her, but instead Jessie felt a surge of confidence that surprised her with its intensity. Her father had been preparing her for this role her entire life, teaching her not just the practical skills she'd need, but the moral foundation that would guide her decisions when the moment came. But the letters also revealed the extent of the danger she faced. The criminal organization her father had been investigating wasn't just local corruption run amok. It was a sophisticated operation with connections that reached far beyond Copper Ridge. References to territorial political interests and mining consortium coordination suggested that the illegal extraction was part of a larger scheme involving powerful people in multiple states. Most disturbing of all was a warning about the potential for extreme measures if the investigation threatened to expose the full scope of the operation. Her father's death hadn't been an act of desperation by local criminals. It had been a calculated assassination ordered by people who viewed murder as simply another business expense. As Jessie studied the letters by lamplight, Buck's nervous whinnying from the corral alerted her to approaching riders. She quickly hid the correspondence and moved to the window, where she saw 3 familiar figures dismounting near her front gate. Cromwell the banker led the group, accompanied by 2 men she recognized as prominent ranchers from the area. Their late evening visit wasn't a social call. "Miss McCall," Cromwell called from the porch, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man delivering an ultimatum. "We need to have a conversation about your situation here." Jessie stepped outside, keeping her expression neutral despite the racing of her heart. "It's rather late for a business call, Mr. Cromwell. This couldn't wait. I've received some disturbing reports about your activities lately. Digging around the property, asking questions in town about people who are none of your concern." His tone grew harder. "Some folks are beginning to wonder if you've found things that might be better left buried." The threat was barely veiled, and Jessie understood that her careful investigations hadn't been as secret as she'd hoped. Someone had been watching her more closely than she'd realized, and that someone had decided it was time to take direct action. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Cromwell. I've been working on repairs around the ranch, nothing more." One of the ranchers stepped forward, Jake Morrison, whose property bordered hers to the north. "Miss McCall, we're here as friends, trying to help you avoid making a serious mistake. This land has a history you don't understand, and some of that history involves things that could be dangerous for a young lady to get mixed up in." "What kind of history?" Jessie asked, genuinely curious to hear how they'd explain their activities. Cromwell exchanged glances with his companions before answering. "Your father was involved in some business arrangements that didn't work out the way he'd hoped, left some debts, some obligations that transfer to his estate. We're prepared to help you settle those obligations and get yourself established somewhere more suitable." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Jessie could see the tension in their postures, the way their eyes kept scanning the property as if looking for signs of her discoveries. They knew she'd found something, but they weren't sure exactly what or how much she understood. "I wasn't aware of any debts beyond the mortgage," she said carefully. "There are always obligations that don't make it into official records," Morrison replied. "Business partnerships, informal agreements, that sort of thing. Your father was a good man, but he got in over his head toward the end." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with the 3 men taking turns explaining why. She needed to accept their help and abandon the ranch. Their offers grew progressively more generous, but their demeanor grew progressively more threatening when she continued to politely decline. Finally, Cromwell played what he clearly considered his strongest card. "Miss McCall, I hate to be blunt, But you're behind on your mortgage payments and winter's coming. This property can't support you, and you can't afford to maintain it. I'm trying to help you avoid foreclosure, but my patience isn't unlimited. I understand your concern, Mr. Cromwell, but I'm managing fine. The mortgage payments will be made. With what money? Morrison demanded, his false friendliness finally slipping. You've got no income, no family to help you, and property that's worthless for any practical purpose. What exactly do you think you're going to do? Jessie met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage she'd inherited from her father. And I'll figure something out, I always do. After they left, she sat on her porch with Buck nearby, understanding that the confrontation had marked a turning point. They'd revealed their awareness of her activities and their willingness to use both financial pressure and implied threats to force her compliance. But they'd also revealed something else, their desperation. Men who held all the advantages didn't make threatening late-night visits to 12-year-old girls unless they were genuinely worried about what she might discover or expose. The original land deed that would change everything lay in the most obvious place of all, filed away in the county records office, hidden in plain sight among thousands of documents that no one had bothered to examine closely in decades. Jessie's discovery of it came about through the kind of methodical investigation her father had trained her to conduct, following paper trails that others had assumed were too boring or complex to merit attention. The morning after Cromwell's threatening visit, Jessie made what appeared to be an innocent trip to town, carrying herself with the defeated posture of a girl who'd finally accepted the impossibility of her situation. She let Mrs. Henderson see her counting coins with obvious concern, asked quietly about the cheapest boarding arrangements in town, and generally behaved like someone preparing to surrender her dreams of keeping the ranch. But her real destination was the county courthouse, where decades of land records were stored in dusty files that the current clerk, a young man named Peter Williams, was eager to help her navigate. I'm trying to understand exactly what property my father owned, she explained with the kind of innocent confusion that adults found endearing rather than suspicious. Some people have been asking questions about boundaries and rights, and I want to make sure I understand what's mine and what isn't. Williams proved surprisingly helpful, pulling files and explaining the basic principles of land ownership, while Jessie took careful notes. Most of the documents confirmed what she'd already known. Her father had purchased a modest ranch with standard agricultural rights and responsibilities, but then Williams pulled out a file that made her heart skip. "Here's something interesting," he said, spreading out a map that was far more detailed than any she'd seen before. "This is the original territorial survey from when this land was first claimed. Your father's property is marked here, but look at these boundary descriptions." Jessie studied the map with growing amazement. The survey showed her ranch as just a small portion of a much larger tract of land that extended in all directions from her current property. According to the original filing, Samuel McCall had claimed mineral rights to an area that encompassed most of what was now considered the town of Copper Ridge and several of the largest ranches in the region. "This can't be right," she said, though her pulse was racing with excitement. "Well, it's the original filing," Williams replied, consulting additional documents. "Sometimes the boundaries got adjusted over time as new claims were filed, but this shows your father's original stake. Let me see if there are any subsequent modifications." What they found in the subsequent filings was a pattern of fraud so brazen that Jessie could hardly believe it had gone undetected for so long. Over the course of 20 years, various local officials had filed papers that systematically reduced the legal description of the McCall property, transferring portions to other claimants through a series of transactions that appeared legitimate on their surface, but were actually coordinated theft. The most shocking discovery was that many of these fraudulent transfers had been notarized by Cromwell himself, using his authority as a bank officer to legitimize documents that had no legal foundation. Worse still, the properties had then been sold to the same group of ranchers and businessmen who'd been conducting the illegal mining operations. "Mr. Williams," Jessie said carefully, "what would happen if someone could prove that these later filings were fraudulent?" The young clerk whistled softly as he considered the implications. "Well, if the original claim was valid and the subsequent transfers were illegal, then technically the property would revert to the original owner's heir. But we're talking about a lot of land here, Miss McCall. Some very important people have been operating under the assumption that they own property that might actually belong to you." The full scope of what her father had been protecting became clear as Jessie studied the documents. He hadn't just been investigating theft of minerals from his property. He'd been documenting the systematic theft of the property itself. The criminals hadn't just been extracting valuable resources. They'd been stealing the land that contained those resources, using their positions of authority to legitimize what amounted to organized robbery on a massive scale. But the most devastating revelation came when Williams showed her the mineral rights documentation. According to the original territorial survey, the McCall claim included exclusive rights to all subsurface resources throughout the disputed area. Every ounce of copper and silver that had been extracted over the past 2 decades had been stolen, not just from the federal government, but from her family directly. "How much money are we talking about?" Jessie asked, though she almost dreaded the answer. Williams consulted a recent mining assessment report based on what's been extracted so far and estimated future value of remaining deposits, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million, maybe more. $4 million. The sum was so enormous that Jessie could barely comprehend it. Her father hadn't just been protecting a valuable ranch, he'd been safeguarding one of the richest mineral claims in the territory, worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. As the implications sank in, she understood why her father had been killed and why powerful people were so desperate to force her away from the property. They weren't just worried about exposure of their criminal activities. They were terrified of losing access to wealth that they'd been stealing for decades. But the documents also revealed something else that changed her understanding of the entire situation. Hidden among the filing papers was a copy of a federal territorial statute that Williams had to explain to her in detail. "This is interesting," he said, pointing to a particular section. "According to territorial law, when mineral rights are stolen through fraudulent means, the rightful owner is entitled not just to recovery of the property, but to compensation for all resources extracted during the period of illegal occupation, plus penalties. The penalties alone would bankrupt everyone involved in the conspiracy. More importantly, the federal statute gave territorial authorities the power to seize all assets of anyone involved in such fraud, meaning that Cromwell's bank, Morrison's ranch, and the properties of everyone else involved could be confiscated to satisfy the debt owed to her family. She was no longer just a girl trying to save her ranch. She was the rightful owner of millions of dollars in stolen property, with the legal authority to destroy the fortunes of everyone who'd participated in her father's murder. The ride home gave her time to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Buck seemed to sense her excitement, stepping more lively than usual as they made their way back to the ranch that was actually just a small portion of her true inheritance. But with understanding came the awareness of just how much danger she was in. The people who'd killed her father for investigating their crimes would certainly kill her for possessing the evidence that could destroy them completely. She wasn't just dealing with local corruption anymore. She was threatening the economic foundation that supported half the territory's political structure. That evening, as she sat on her porch reviewing the copies Williams had helped her make of the crucial documents, Jessie felt the weight of her father's final gift. He'd given her more than treasure or property. He'd given her the power to demand justice, not just for his murder, but for decades of systematic theft from their family and from the federal government itself. The scared little girl who'd inherited a worthless ranch was truly gone forever. In her place sat a young woman who owned property worth millions, who held evidence that could topple governments, and who finally understood that her father's faith in her ability to complete his mission had been entirely justified. Tomorrow, she would find the location marked with the star and square and discover what her father had considered the completion of his assignment. But tonight, she would plan her next moves with the careful strategy of someone who held the power to transform not just her own life, but the entire balance of power in Copper Ridge and beyond. Her father's final letter waited in the location marked with the star and square, buried beneath a cairn of stones that had weathered decades of desert storms without revealing their secret. The spot lay at the highest point of her property, land that she now knew extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, where the view encompassed the entire valley that contained Copper Ridge and the surrounding ranches. Following her compass to this final cache had required a full day's journey on foot, with Buck carrying the tools she'd need for excavation. The magnetic anomaly here was stronger than any she'd encountered, causing the compass needle to spin wildly, as if the earth itself were charged with unusual energy. What she found beneath the carefully arranged stones was a time capsule of her father's deepest thoughts and most carefully laid plans. The container was larger than the others, and inside it, wrapped in oiled leather and preserved with meticulous care, lay the culmination of everything Samuel McCall had worked toward during his years of covert investigation. The letter was addressed to her specifically, written in her father's careful handwriting and dated just 1 week before his death. As she read it by the light of the setting sun, with Buck grazing peacefully nearby, Jessie felt her father's presence more strongly than at any time since his passing. "My dearest Jessie Mae," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have proven yourself worthy of the trust I placed in you from the day you were born. You have followed the trail I left, understood the clues I provided, and discovered the truth that I died protecting. I am proud of you beyond words, and I know that your mother would be proud as well." The letter went on to explain the full scope of his plan, detailing strategies he'd developed over years of careful observation and investigation. Every aspect of her inheritance had been designed not just to preserve evidence of criminal activity, but to provide her with the tools and authority she'd need to seek justice when the time came. "You now hold more than enough evidence to destroy the criminal conspiracy that has stolen from our family and from the federal government," he wrote. "But evidence alone is not enough. You must be strategic in how you use what you've learned, because the people you're dealing with have shown they will kill to protect their secrets." Her father had anticipated every aspect of the situation she now faced, including the attempts at intimidation and the threats of foreclosure. He'd even predicted that Cromwell and his associates would eventually reveal themselves through their own desperation to silence her. "By now they will have shown their hand," the letter continued. "They will have made threats, offered bribes, or attempted to force you from the property through legal manipulation. This is actually part of what we need, evidence of their current criminal activity to supplement the historical documentation you've discovered." The letter included detailed instructions for the next phase of his plan. He'd established contact protocols with federal authorities in Denver, including specific code words that would identify her as his legitimate successor and grant her access to resources that territorial agents could provide. Most importantly, he'd arranged for Colonel Thorne to serve as her advocate and protector once she activated the final phase of the investigation. "James Thorne is the most honorable man I've ever known," her father wrote. "He has been my partner in this mission from the beginning, and he will not abandon you when you need his help. Send the telegram you'll find in this package, and he will come to Copper Ridge with all the authority and resources the federal government can provide." The pre-written telegram was simple, but would clearly communicate the urgency of her situation. "Package delivered. Assistance required immediately. Small bird flying home. The code was obviously one that Thorne would recognize, probably referring to her father's nickname for her and indicating that she'd successfully uncovered his evidence. But the most important element of her father's final instructions involved the timing of her revelations. Rather than simply turning over evidence to federal authorities and hoping for justice, he devised a strategy that would force the criminals to expose themselves publicly while ensuring that their crimes could never be covered up or minimized. "You must gather all the principal conspirators in one place," the letter explained, "and confront them with the evidence when they have no opportunity to escape or destroy documentation. They must be caught in the act of threatening you or attempting to silence you so that their current criminality is witnessed by federal authorities." The plan was audacious but brilliant. Her father had identified a way to use the criminals' own desperation against them, turning their attempts to intimidate her into the final evidence needed to ensure their prosecution and conviction. The letter concluded with words that brought tears to her eyes. "You are not just my daughter, Jessie Mae. You are my partner, my successor, and the person I trust to see justice done for all the victims of these crimes. I have given you everything you need to succeed, but success will require courage that only you can provide. I believe in you completely, just as I have believed in you every day since you were born." As darkness fell over the valley, Jessie sat beside the empty cache with her father's letter in her hands, looking down at the lights of Copper Ridge and understanding finally that she held the power to change the fate of everyone who lived there. The criminals who'd thought they were beyond consequences were about to discover that Samuel McCall's mission lived on through his daughter. But executing her father's plan would require allies, and she knew exactly where to find them. Martha. Whitman had shown consistent kindness and had clearly known more about her father's activities than she'd revealed. Peter Williams at the courthouse had proven helpful and seemed genuinely committed to legal accuracy. Most importantly, there were people in Copper Ridge who'd been victims of the conspiracy without knowing it, property owners who'd lost land through fraudulent transfers, workers who'd been cheated of fair wages, families who'd struggled while others profited from theft. The next morning brought a visitor that confirmed her father's prediction about the timing of events. Colonel James Thorne arrived at her ranch just after sunrise, riding a well-maintained horse and carrying himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. He was older than in the photograph she'd found, his hair completely grey now, but his eyes held the same intelligence and determination that had characterized his correspondence with her father. "Miss McCall," he said, dismounting and approaching her porch with careful respect. "I received your telegram. I'm James Thorne, and I was your father's partner in the work he was doing here." The relief that flooded through her was almost overwhelming. For weeks, she'd been carrying the weight of her discoveries alone, never certain whether she was interpreting her father's clues correctly or whether she possessed the skills necessary to seek justice for his murder. Now she had an ally who understood the full scope of what she'd inherited. "Colonel Thorne," she replied, standing to greet him properly. "I've read your letters to my father. I know you were friends as well as partners." "Samuel McCall was the finest man I ever served with," Thorne said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "His death was a loss to the nation as well as to you personally, but his work doesn't have to die with him if you're willing to help me complete what he started." Over the course of the morning, Jessie shared everything she'd discovered, showing Thorne the caches, the documents, and the evidence she'd gathered about the criminal conspiracy. His reactions confirmed that her interpretations had been accurate, and his expertise filled in details that she'd missed or misunderstood. Most importantly, he brought news that the federal government was prepared to take decisive action based on her father's investigation. "We've been building cases against similar operations throughout the territory," he explained. What you've uncovered here represents the missing piece that will allow us to prosecute not just the local criminals, but the larger network they're part of. But he also confirmed her father's warnings about the danger she faced. These people have already killed once to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill again if they believe you pose a threat to their operation. We need to be very careful about how we proceed. Together, they refined her father's final plan, adapting it to take advantage of resources and authority that Thorne could provide. The strategy would require her to appear vulnerable and isolated while secretly being protected by federal agents. She would need to convincingly play the role of a defeated child while actually controlling every aspect of the confrontation that would expose the criminals. It was a dangerous game, but it was also the only way to ensure that justice was served. Not just for her father's murder, but for all the victims of the conspiracy he died investigating. The trap was set for the following Tuesday, when Cromwell's mortgage deadline would provide the perfect pretext for the final confrontation. Jessie spent the intervening days playing her role perfectly, appearing defeated, asking desperate questions about boarding houses in town, and even visiting the bank to plead for an extension she knew would be denied. Colonel Thorne and his team of federal agents remained hidden in the hills surrounding her property, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid detection by the criminals who were undoubtedly watching her every move. Buck seemed to sense the tension, staying close to the house and whinnying nervously whenever riders approached in the distance. The evidence portfolio that would seal the conspirators' fate lay hidden in her father's old saddlebags, carefully organized and documented according to federal legal standards that Thorne had explained to her. Every document had been copied, every photograph catalogued, every piece of correspondence verified and authenticated. When the moment came to present the evidence, there would be no opportunity for denial or legal maneuvering. Cromwell arrived. Precisely on schedule, accompanied by Morrison and 2 other men she recognized as prominent members of the town council. They rode up to her porch with the confidence of people who believed they held all the advantages, dismounting with the slow deliberation of men delivering an ultimatum. "Miss McCall," Cromwell began, his voice carrying false sympathy that barely concealed his satisfaction. "I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road. The mortgage payment was due yesterday, and you've been unable to meet your obligations." Jessie stepped onto the porch, carrying herself with the defeated posture she'd been practicing. Buck stood nearby, his presence providing moral support as she faced the men who'd killed her father. "Mr. Cromwell, I've been trying to find the money. Surely you can give me a few more days." "I'm afraid not. Business is business, and the bank has responsibilities to its depositors." He produced a legal document from his coat pocket. "This is a foreclosure notice. You have until sunset tomorrow to vacate the property." Morrison stepped forward, playing his assigned role in their scripted intimidation. "Now, we're not heartless. Miss McCall, we're prepared to help you with your transition. I'm willing to pay you a fair price for your personal belongings, the horse, any tools your father left behind, enough to get you set up somewhere more appropriate for a young lady." "And if I refuse to leave?" Jessie asked, allowing her voice to carry the tremor of fear they expected to hear. The third man, whom she now recognized as the county sheriff, spoke for the first time. "Well, miss, that would be trespassing on bank property. I'd have to arrest you, and nobody wants that kind of unpleasantness." This was the moment her father had planned for, when their threats would transition from implied to explicit. Jessie reached into her saddlebags, withdrawing not the surrender documents they expected, but the carefully organized evidence portfolio that would destroy their lives. "Before I go," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I think you gentlemen should see what I found among my father's belongings." Cromwell's expression shifted from confident satisfaction to wary concern as she spread the first documents across. The porch railing, the original land deed, the mineral rights documentation, the geological surveys, each piece of evidence landed like a physical blow. "Where did you get these?" Morrison demanded, his composure cracking. "From my father's files. It seems he kept very detailed records of your activities." Jessie's voice carried a calm authority that made all four men step back involuntarily. "Did you know that every acre you've been mining actually belongs to me? That every ounce of copper and silver you've extracted has been theft?" The sheriff reached for his gun, but froze when three federal agents emerged from concealment with weapons drawn. Colonel Thorne stepped into view, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, theft of federal resources, and murder." Cromwell's face went white. "Murder? That's ridiculous. Samuel McCall died of natural causes." "Samuel McCall was poisoned over a period of months," Thorne replied coldly. "We have documentation of your purchase of the specific compounds used, along with witness testimony about your access to his food supply." The trap had sprung perfectly. The criminals stood exposed, caught in the act of threatening her, while federal agents witnessed their confessions and denials. Everything her father had planned was unfolding exactly as he'd envisioned. But even as triumph surged through her, Jessie felt the weight of what had been lost. Her father should have been here to see justice served, should have lived to watch. The criminals who'd destroyed so many lives finally faced consequences for their actions. Buck moved closer, sensing her emotional turmoil and offering the comfort that only a loyal companion could provide. Together, they watched as the men who'd terrorized Copper Ridge for decades were placed in chains and prepared for transport to federal custody. The first phase of justice had been achieved, but Jessie knew that the real work, rebuilding trust, restoring stolen property, and healing the wounds left by years of corruption, was just beginning. The recovery of the $4 million cash became a public spectacle that transformed Copper Ridge forever. With federal authority backing her claims and the criminals in custody, Jessie led Colonel Thorne and his team to the final location. Her father had marked on his map the spot where decades of stolen wealth had been carefully preserved, waiting for the day when justice could finally be served. The excavation took place in the town square, witnessed by virtually every resident of Copper Ridge, as federal agents used professional equipment to uncover what Samuel McCall had hidden beneath the old stone foundation of the town's original trading post. The location had been chosen with characteristic, strategic thinking, a place where no one would think to look, protected by the weight of history and the assumption that treasures were hidden in remote locations rather than in plain sight. What they found exceeded even Jessie's expectations. Her father had collected not just documentation of the crimes committed against their family, but actual samples of the stolen minerals, carefully catalogued and preserved as evidence. More importantly, he'd recovered and hidden a significant portion of the extracted wealth itself. Gold and silver coins, refined copper ingots, and precious stones that represented years of illegal mining operations. "My God," Colonel Thorne whispered, as the first strongbox was lifted from its underground hiding place. Samuel didn't just document the theft, he systematically recovered what they'd stolen. The crowd that had gathered to watch the excavation grew increasingly agitated as the scope of the recovery became clear. Many of the townspeople were learning for the first time about the illegal operations that had been conducted in their community, and their reactions ranged from shock to anger to demands for answers about who else might have been involved. Mrs. Whitman pushed through the crowd to reach Jessie's side, her elderly face filled with pride and amazement. "Child," she said, grasping Jessie's hands, "I always knew your father was special, but this is justice on a scale I never imagined possible." Peter Williams from the courthouse stood nearby, carefully documenting the recovery process and ensuring that proper legal procedures were followed. His assistance had been crucial in establishing the legitimacy of Jessie's claims, and his presence now provided additional credibility to the federal investigation. As each container was opened and its contents catalogued, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to everyone present. The stolen wealth represented not just crimes against the McCall family, but theft from every property owner in the region whose mineral rights had been violated. Families who'd struggled financially, while others grew wealthy from resources stolen from beneath their feet, finally understood why their own efforts at prosperity had been so difficult. But the most dramatic moment came when the final strongbox was opened, revealing not just more stolen treasure, but a complete record of every person who'd participated in the conspiracy over the years. Her father had maintained detailed files on corruption that extended far beyond the principal criminals who'd been arrested, documenting a network of complicity that reached into every aspect of Copper Ridge's government and business community. How many people knew? Demanded Tom Bradley, the neighboring rancher who'd offered to lease her property. His face was pale as he realized how close he'd come to becoming part of the conspiracy himself. Colonel Thorne consulted the recovered documents before answering. According to Agent McCall's records, the core conspiracy involved 12 individuals in positions of authority, but there were dozens of others who provided assistance, transportation, or simply looked the other way in exchange for modest payments. The revelation that their community had been systematically looted by its own leadership created a wave of anger that threatened to become dangerous. Some of the crowd began calling for immediate action against anyone whose name appeared in the recovered files, regardless of the level of their involvement. Jessie climbed onto a wooden crate that had contained some of her father's evidence, raising her voice to address the crowd that had gathered. Buck stood beside her, his presence lending her the confidence she needed to speak to adults who were struggling to understand how their world had been turned upside down. My father spent years trying to protect this community from the people who were stealing from all of us, she began, her young voice carrying clearly across the square. He didn't want revenge, he wanted justice. He wanted the truth to come out so that honest people could live without being cheated by those they trusted. The crowd gradually quieted as she continued. The people who stole from us are going to face the consequences of their actions. The money they took will be returned to the families and businesses they cheated. But we can't let anger turn us into the kind of people who destroyed our community in the first place. Her words carried the wisdom her father had instilled in her, the understanding that justice meant more than punishment. It meant rebuilding trust and creating a community where such corruption could never take root again. The 12-year-old girl who'd inherited a worthless ranch had become a voice for healing and renewal that even hardened adults could respect. As the sun set over Copper Ridge on that historic day, Jessie stood in the town square surrounded by evidence of her father's final victory, knowing that his mission had been completed and his faith in her had been justified. 6 months later, the restored ranch sign, bearing both her father's name and her own, caught the morning sunlight as Jessie Mae McCall stood on her newly rebuilt porch, watching Buck graze in pastures that now officially belonged to her family for generations to come. The sign was more than decoration. It was a declaration that the McCall legacy had not only survived the conspiracy that tried to destroy it, but had emerged stronger and more honorable than ever. The transformation of both the ranch and the community had exceeded everyone's expectations. With the recovered wealth and the federal government's compensation for decades of theft, Jessie had been able to restore the property to the productive ranch her father had always envisioned. The new barn stood strong and straight. The house had been rebuilt with care and attention to detail, and the land itself had been restored to the kind of working ranch that could support not just her needs, but provide employment for several of the families whose breadwinners had been imprisoned for their participation in the conspiracy. But the changes went far beyond her own property. The exposure of the corruption had led to a complete restructuring of Copper Ridge's government and business community. New leaders had emerged, people like Peter Williams, who'd been elected mayor based on his commitment to transparency and legal accuracy, and Martha Whitman, who despite her age had accepted appointment as the town's new bank president after Cromwell's institution had been seized by federal authorities. Colonel Thorne had become a regular visitor to the ranch, partly in his official capacity as the federal agent overseeing the ongoing prosecutions, but increasingly as a friend who'd come to view Jessie as the daughter he'd never had. His presence provided not just protection, but guidance as she navigated the complex responsibilities that came with being one of the wealthiest property owners in the territory. "You know," he said, joining her on the porch for their morning coffee, "your father would be amazed by what you've accomplished. He hoped you'd be able to complete his mission, but I don't think even he imagined you'd transform the entire community in the process." Jessie smiled, stroking Buck's neck as the old horse wandered over to greet them. "He taught me that justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about creating something better for the people who've been hurt." The legal proceedings had concluded the previous month, with all 12 principal conspirators receiving lengthy federal prison sentences. Cromwell and Morrison, as the leaders of the operation, had been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, while the others had received terms ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. More importantly, the federal court had ordered the seizure of all assets acquired through the illegal mining operations, with the proceeds being distributed to the victims of the conspiracy. But Jessie had insisted that the restoration efforts go beyond simple financial compensation. Working with Colonel Thorne and the new territorial government, she'd established programs to help families whose lives had been disrupted by the conspiracy. The McCall Foundation, as it came to be known, provided educational opportunities, business loans, and support for widows and orphans whose situations had been worsened by the economic disruption caused by decades of theft. The foundation's most important project was the new school that had been built in Copper Ridge, with Jessie personally ensuring that it would provide the kind of education that would prepare young people to recognize and resist corruption in whatever forms it might take in the future. She'd insisted that the curriculum include not just traditional subjects, but lessons in civics, law, and the ethical responsibilities that came with positions of trust and authority. Her own education had been enriched by tutors that Colonel Thorne had arranged, ensuring that she received the preparation she'd need to manage her substantial holdings and continue her father's work as she matured. But the most important lessons continued to come from her daily interactions with the community that had been transformed by her courage and determination. Tom Bradley had become one of her closest neighbors and advisors, his initial offer to lease her property having evolved into a partnership that benefited both their operations. He'd been one of the first people to recognize that the young woman who'd exposed the conspiracy possessed wisdom and judgment that transcended her years. "Miss McCall," he'd said during one of their planning meetings, "I've been ranching in this territory for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone handle responsibility the way you do. Your father raised you well, but what you've become is something special entirely." The ranch itself had become a symbol of renewal and possibility throughout the territory. Visitors came regularly to see the place where a 12-year-old girl had single-handedly exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in the region's history. But they also came to see the living proof that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Standing on her porch that morning, watching Buck graze contentedly in the distance, Jessie felt her father's presence in the wind that still never stopped blowing across the desert. But now that wind carried different messages, hope instead of whispers, possibility instead of mockery, and the promise that justice, once achieved, could create foundations strong enough to support generations of honest prosperity. The scared little girl who'd inherited what everyone called a worthless ranch was gone, transformed into a young woman who'd discovered that her true inheritance wasn't land or money, but the values and courage that her father had instilled in her from birth. She'd honored his memory not just by completing his mission, but by using the fruits of that mission to create the kind of community he'd always believed was possible. Buck's gentle whinny drew her attention back to the present, and she smiled, as she realized that even her old companion seemed more content now that their struggles had given way to the peaceful prosperity they'd both earned. The McCall Ranch was finally what it had always been meant to be, a place where justice lived, where hard work was rewarded, and where the legacy of Samuel McCall would continue to inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort and principle over profit. The story had come full circle, from loss to discovery to triumph, but Jessie knew that the most important chapters were still to be written.